Picture this, a massive, stunningly beautiful, and completely empty land. We're talking endless mountains, deep forests, and pristine lakes, but not a single person around. Well, that was North America many thousands of years ago. Now, fast forward to today. That exact same land is home to a 300 million person superpower, boasting an incredibly rich, complex, and vibrant culture. In fact, chances are pretty high that the technology, the politics, or the pop culture of this nation is affecting your daily life right at this very moment. So how in the world did that incredible transformation happen? Welcome to This Explainer, where we are going to untangle the fascinating story of the United States of America. Okay, let's dive into this. To make sense of it all, we are going to neatly organize this massive country's history and culture into 6 distinct chapters: birth of a nation, conflict, expansion and rights, a nation of immigrants, the rulebook, U.S. government, the American way of life, and finally, a quick trip from coast to coast. Chapter 1, Birth of a Nation. Let's start at the literal ground zero of the country's history. 16,000 years. Just wrap your head around that number for a second. That massive chunk of time marks the moment when the very first threads of this American tapestry were woven. People likely crossed over into Alaska from Asia, slowly moving south and becoming the Native Americans. This happened long before any European explorers ever dreamed of setting foot on the continent. And these weren't just a few small bands of travelers. They established hundreds of distinct groups, speaking over 2,000 different languages across the land. Let's move through the timeline and see how this builds. The European chapter really kicks off in 1492 when Christopher Columbus reached the Caribbean. But it wasn't until the 17th century that folks really started laying down roots. In 1607, the British started the Jamestown colony, which, fun fact, basically survived its brutal early years by figuring out how to grow tobacco. Then, in 1620, you have the Pilgrims arriving on the Mayflower looking for religious freedom. They actually celebrated their survival alongside Native Americans in what we now famously call Thanksgiving. Fast forward a bit, and tensions with Britain over high taxes completely boiled over. This culminated in 1776 when Thomas Jefferson wrote the famous Declaration of Independence, boldly demanding the right to life, freedom, and the pursuit of happiness. Moving right along to Chapter 2, Conflict, Expansion, and Rights. So the newly independent country is growing incredibly fast. We're talking 31 million people by the mid-19th century. But getting there came with some immense and frankly tragic growing pains. The young nation was deeply, fundamentally divided. Up in the northern states, they were building factories, they had a larger male population, and they opposed the expansion of slavery. But down in the southern states, it was a totally different world. They relied heavily on slave labor brought over from Africa to work these vast cotton fields, and they were bringing in a ton of money selling that cotton to Britain. These stark, devastating differences simply couldn't be resolved peacefully. Ultimately, in 1861, the terrible Civil War broke out between the two halves of the country, a devastating conflict that resulted in at least 600,000 deaths. Government of the people, by the people, for the people. You've probably heard that before, right? President Abraham Lincoln spoke those legendary words during his Gettysburg Address in 1863, right on the heels of a crucial, bloody battle. This brilliantly illustrates Lincoln's vision. It became a defining moment for American freedom, ensuring that the unified nation would actually survive and that the horrific practice of slavery would be abolished. This wasn't just a political speech. It laid out the very democratic ideal that a huge chunk of the modern world still looks to today. Now, after the Civil War, the country rapidly pushed westward. By 1869, railways from the east and the west finally met, physically connecting this vast continent. But, this expansion of the Wild West brought terrible consequences for Native Americans, culminating in the incredibly sad end of the Indian Wars at the Battle of Wounded Knee in 1890. And while slavery was officially over, deep prejudice definitely remained. It took nearly another full century of struggle, led by titans like Martin Luther King Jr. and his famous "I Have a Dream" speech, before a major civil rights law was finally passed in 1964 to mandate equality. Through all of this relentless expansion, pushing from the Atlantic Ocean all the way to the Pacific and even beyond, the nation grew state by state. And as they did, the American flag, the famous stars and stripes, added a brand new star for every single state that joined the Union. Today, we're sitting at exactly 50 stars on that flag, with the beautiful Pacific Islands of Hawaii being the very last one added to the mix back in 1959. Okay, so we've looked at the maps, we've traced the borders, and we've swept through the history. But the real heart of this explainer is the people. Who actually lives in those 50 states today? Let's find out in Chapter 3, A Nation of Immigrants. Now, what's really interesting about this is how America famously acted as a giant melting pot. Through processing centers like Ellis Island in New York, the U.S. kept an open door for decades, welcoming millions upon millions of people looking for a fresh start. That history is exactly what shaped the 300 million people living there today. Woven together from every corner of the globe, the population breaks down to roughly 67% white, 13% Hispanic or Spanish-speaking, 13% Black, 4% Asian, and just 1% Native American. It's this massive blending of different cultures and languages, with Spanish actually becoming the increasingly prominent second language of the entire nation.
Which brings us to Chapter 4, the Rulebook, U.S. Government.
So, logistically speaking, how do you keep a massive, incredibly diverse population organized and moving in the same direction? Well, within a system where it's worth pointing out women finally won the right to vote in 1920, the government is cleverly broken down into three separate but equal parts. This is entirely by design to make sure no single person gets all the power. First up, you have Congress, which is in charge of actually making the laws. Then there's the president, who lives in the White House, acts as the chief of the country in the military, and is elected for a 4-year term. Finally, the Supreme Court, made up of 9 judges, decides exactly what those laws mean in the real world. Each of these branches constantly checks the others. So Congress can say no to the president, and the Supreme Court can turn around and say a law made by Congress is invalid.
Within this whole framework, there are 2 massive political parties that Americans usually vote for. The Republican Party generally believes that individuals should work to help themselves, and because of that, they think taxes should be kept as low as possible. On the flip side, the Democratic Party believes that the government has a fundamental responsibility to step in and help the poor and vulnerable, which naturally requires higher taxes to fund those programs. It's essentially the great American debate over the role of government itself.
Okay, time to shift gears a bit. Chapter 5, The American Way of Life. Let's step away from the rulebooks and politics to celebrate the cultural exports. I mean, from movies to television, the whole world recognizes American culture. So the crucial point here is that America's famous music is entirely a product of its diverse immigrant and historical roots blending together in real time. Blues and jazz, they were born from the songs of Black slaves in the South and vibrant places like New Orleans, giving us absolute legends like Louis Armstrong and Muddy Waters. Country music sprang directly from Scottish and Irish immigrants settling in the Appalachian Mountains, paving the way for icons like Johnny Cash. And rap? That emerged straight from Black and Puerto Rican youth in New York City, eventually giving the world global superstars like Snoop Dogg and Eminem. But the culture goes way beyond music for sure. Think about the year 1886. That was the year a man named John Pemberton whipped up the very first batch of Coca-Cola. Since then, American fast food, we're talking hamburgers and French fries, has spread to literally almost every country on Earth. Back inside the US, immigrants were blending their traditional foods to create entirely new, mouth-watering styles like Tex-Mex down in the Southwest. And we can't forget sports. American football, basketball, and of course, baseball, a game permanently elevated to global fame by larger-than-life legends like the great Babe Ruth. Finally, let's hit the road. Chapter 6, Coast to Coast. We're going to take a rapid geographical tour to see the actual physical spaces where this American way of life happens. The cities alone offer some mind-blowing contrasts. On the East Coast, you've got historic Boston with Harvard University, the massive, iconic skyscrapers of New York City like the Empire State Building, and the capital, Washington, D.C., which uniquely doesn't have any skyscrapers at all. Over in the Midwest, you've got the famously windy city of Chicago. But then, travel out to the West Coast, and the whole vibe completely changes. You've got Seattle, totally driven by tech and coffee. San Francisco, famous for the Golden Gate Bridge and, well, occasional earthquakes. And Los Angeles, the sunny, sprawling, movie-obsessed home of Hollywood. But seriously, leave the cities behind, and the natural extremes of the USA are just staggering. I mean, in California alone, you can stand on the peak of Mount Whitney, over 4,400 meters high, and then drive down into Death Valley, which is literally 86 meters below sea level. There's the Grand Canyon in Arizona, a breathtakingly huge river valley 1,600 meters deep, and if you travel to the absolute outer edges of the map, you can freeze under the spectacular northern lights up in Alaska, or kick back on the warm tropical beaches of Hawaii. The geographical tapestry is absolutely just as varied as the people who live there. And that brings us to the end of our explainer. We've seen how a vast, empty land transformed into a bustling superpower, driven by diverse groups of immigrants, immense internal conflicts, and a wildly popular, globally exported culture. The United States is this ever-changing tapestry, constantly being rewoven with new people and fresh ideas. So, with such a complex past and incredible diversity, what do you think the next chapter of the American story will look like? Well, that's a question I'll leave for you to chew on as you continue to explore this fascinating country on your own. Catch you next time.